Hello and welcome to the test screening. I'm Billy.
I'm Chloe. We're two film school graduates and cinephiles who can't seem to get enough of the big screen.
So now we're bringing you our weekly insights into the biggest releases, hottest topics and forgotten classics every Monday.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the test screening. My name is Chloe.
And my name's Billy.
And we're going to kick off this week by talking about the newly announced adaptation of a David Cronenberg film into a TV series. So, Billy, what is this and what's it all about?
So Dead Ringers is a 1988 psychological thriller from director David Cronenberg. It's one of his most famous, distinct and revered films, and probably out of the ones I've seen, my personal favourite of his work. It's about two twin gynecologists, Elliot and Beverly Mantle, who perform ethically questionable procedures on infertile women. They're kind of viewed as real trailblazers in the field of gynecology and really experts and masters of the given field. Because they're identical twins, they also have they have very complicated personal lives where one of them is completely romantically and socially inept. So they kind of use the fact that they're identical to their advantage to kind of fulfill their romantic and social desires in some very sort of questionable, very, very dark sequences. There's some really interesting examinations of, to what extent, can you be your own person if you're really like tied to a sibling, and how much, they define each other's lives and their own success. It's a really terrific film, and of course it's got David Cronenberg's usual really icy, cold, disturbing, body horror inflected visuals with these really strange sort of red get-ups that they have in their surgery scenes, and all these strange twisted medical apparatus that they use. And it's been announced that on April 21st, we will have a 6-episode mini-series where Elliot and Beverly will be played by Rachel Weisz. They're played by Jeremy Irons in a really great dual performance in the original film. And I think she's a really inspired casting choice. I mean, considering her role in, I think particularly, 2018's The Favourite, where she plays, the sort of the muse to Olivia Colman's Queen Anne, and she has very kind of complex, pernicious motivations, but also a lot of underlying, sadness and hurt and pain. I think she's a really ideal casting choice. In the past, if you'd have said this to me about 10 years ago or 5-10 years ago, that a film with kind of like classic status as Dead Ringers was being adapted into a TV series, I would be quite trepidatious, because television adaptations of films and, say, video games and other books and works of art haven't always panned out. But given that we've had things like, Normal People recently, which was just amazing. I mentioned Normal People because Alice Birch, who was one of the writers for Normal People, serves as the showrunner for Dead Ringers, and she's also written for Succession, another one of my favorite TV dramas. So we've already got really great pedigree going in there. And we'll be talking about it in a future episode, but we've had the recent brilliant adaptation of The Last of Us video game, HBO TV series, which has gone down a
Can't wait to
storm.
talk about that. I'm so
Me
excited
neither.
to talk
Me
about
neither.
that.
Especially because, I've played the game, you haven't, so we'll get some different perspectives there. But I think adaptations of stories from different mediums have been hit and miss in the past, but we've hit kind of, I think, a real stride with them in recent years. So I'm more excited and hopeful for the Dead Ringers TV series than perhaps I previously would have been. And the promotional images feel like they're keeping a really nice grip on Cronenberg's original kind of stylistic intent and visual style for the series, but kind of giving it, a modern, very cinematic punch and flair. And I'm just really interested to see if Rachel Weisz can, which I'm sure she will, make those personalities as distinct and recognizably, individual as Jeremy Irons does in the original film.
Absolutely. I mean, also in film news this week, obviously we've got the Oscars on Sunday. So by the time this episode is released, we will know who's won all of those big awards. I mean, what I really wanted to focus on, because I've seen some things this week. Obviously, we've been talking about the Oscars a lot on the lead up to the ceremony. But we've got Top Gun Maverick, which is one of the biggest films this year, being nominated for Best Picture. And when I go online and I have a look at like online forums and things, there's a lot of people saying that Top Gun Maverick was the film that saved cinema. And listen, I enjoyed Top Gun Maverick. I'm not sure to what extent I agree with that statement, but it does ring kind of true in a sense. So I just want to see what's your opinion on these films that are supposedly, saving cinema.
Well, I very much enjoyed Top Gun Maverick too. I think it's actually a much superior film than the original Top Gun. I actually showed that to a housemate in third year of uni about the time that we were going to see Top Gun Maverick, and I actually realised that the original Top Gun's kind of bad. It's not even by 80 standards. It's a bit like it's quite ropey, but I
It's
think
real
Maverick's
cheesy.
yeah. I think the um, sort of the behavior of some of the men is very, very questionable. But I think Maverick's a legitimately very good and self-reflexive and actually quite moving piece of work. But I think for me, Top Gun Maverick was like the perfect storm of it's a huge blockbuster with real attention to detail and ambition put into the action sequences, real flying of real planes with the cameras bolted to the planes. So it promised a real spectacle. You had a recognized IP that had been come back to decades later that has a lot of affection and a real fan adoration for it and sentimental attachment, from the audience from the 80s who will have seen it growing up. And also just this very kind of big action film to pull everyone back into the cinemas post the pandemic and generate box office revenue. So that love for the source material and the promise of a great big spectacle at the time at which was released, I think just right time, right place. And I think it helped that it also ended up being actually really quite good in terms of the way it built upon the characters of the original and actually sort of pondered the points that they've reached in life and how they've changed as people in relation to the original, while still, having sort of the lovingly kind of sprinkling in the cheese that's present in the original film. But I
Weird.
don't, I yeah, of course, but I don't think overdoing it either. So I do kind of get a little bit tired of the notion that it saved cinema. I mean, yes, it was incredibly financially successful, but films like Avatar have also done that as well. With things like Avengers Endgame and Black Panther and lots of big budget superhero productions of recent years, does it really do, aside from the timing and the recognized IP, did it really do anything much more than those MCU releases did? I don't really know. In the grander pantheon of cinema, I'm not sure if it really added that much. I mean, for me, another big awards contender, Everything Everywhere All at Once, to me that has, in inverted commas, saved cinema in the storytelling sense because so many people online, columnists and film journalists have said, I couldn't have come up with half the ideas that they did in that film in like 10 or 20 years. It's just it's proven to me that originality really isn't dead. Not that I ever thought it was, but at times you do feel like originality in cinematic storytelling has waned because of how much we're leaning on reboots and remakes and sequels and these established, DC and MCU IPs and ever expanding casts of characters.
Everything Everywhere All at Once was one of the best cinema going experiences that I had had in a long time. I think it
Mhm.
was packed. It was absolutely packed when we went to see it, and it was great. It kind of did give me that Avengers Endgame atmosphere because the audience were reacting to what was on screen. Everyone was laughing together, everyone was going ooh together, everyone was cheering together. So it did kind of have that. It was a movie to go to the cinema to see that
Mm.
reaction. Same as like Endgame and things like that. It's like you can't get the full experience of it until you go and see it in the cinema.
No,
Yeah, I agree. I think films like that are the things that are saving cinema. I think Top Gun maybe does come into that category, but I don't think it belongs alone on that pedestal.
No, I think we should, give it its plaudits for what it did for keeping cinemas afloat from a revenue perspective. But I also think, let's not forget the really great original, you know, feats of storytelling that have gone on in films like Everything Everywhere and Banshees of Inisherin as well, and Tar, and a lot of the great releases that have come out this year. That many of which we've talked about here on the podcast. After Sun as well. The list goes on.
Talking of great releases, that segue. I'm getting smoother every episode. My segues are getting smoother.
Absolutely.
Creed 3. So this is the third Creed film, if you didn't get that from the title. Obviously an expansion of the Rocky universe, and this time it is directed by Michael B. Jordan himself, who plays the titular character. So how was this, and how does it compare to what came before?
So since this is Michael B. Jordan's directorial debut with the series as he takes up the mantle for this third part of the trilogy, I'm not sure if there will be future Creed installments, but I wondered heading into Creed 3, kind of two main points. I felt that whilst decent overall, Creed 2 was overly long and far more languid than the first installment in terms of pacing. I felt it was borderline lifeless in some moments and narratively kind of running on fumes. I didn't really feel like it completely justified its existence, whereas I thought the original Creed really kind of revitalized the franchise. Even, because I thought with Rocky Balboa that we were kind of saying goodbye to the Rocky cinematic universe. But in fact, Creed showed that there was still more valuable story to be told. So in this third entry, I was wondering, is it going to justify its existence from a narrative perspective and provide a compelling yarn? And also, are we going to see Michael B. Jordan putting his own sort of stylistic stamp on the franchise from the director's seat and breathe more energy into the film than Stephen Cable Jr. did in Creed 2? And I'm really pleased to report that Jordan is able to successfully achieve both these feats. His direction and camera moves have the slick and muscular heft of a big budget studio production of a very invigorating and exciting and energetic sports drama, and as an addition to a very popular, well loved, successful at the box office franchise. But he also delivers some really, I think, terrific stylistic flourishes, and he has a deft hand for the more intimate character drama that takes more of a central stage this time than the actual sort of boxing plot lines. That you get these danger-soaked nighttime glare of the car lights crossing the housing projects of South Central Los Angeles in early flashback sequences, and they grab our attention before we're propelled and finessed with some really skillful match cuts into the present day fight and training sequences. And whilst I don't think he infuses the fights and the film at large with quite the same, bustling momentum and kinetic energy that Ryan Coogler embraced in the first Creed, I thought his direction in the first Creed really made that film. Michael B. Jordan, I do think he's leaned more into the balletic nature of the fight choreography, which gives these face-offs an even greater athletic feel, which for me was sorely missing from Creed 2. There's a particularly effective sequence that I really loved that takes on this quite surprisingly surrealist approach where the audience, the lights, the cameras, and all the extraneous noise, it all just vanishes from the stadium that this boxing match is taking place in. And it's almost like it's a dream sequence. And, time becomes more elastic as the two boxers kind of feel the energy of the moment and go all out on each other. It's like, all the extraneous distractions have melted away and they're just like time is nothing and they're just in the moment with each other. That sequence was a real highlight for me. On the topic of Jonathan Majors, because he was also a concern of mine going in, I spoke in a previous episode about how I really was not a fan of his performance in the new Ant-Man film. I thought he was awkward and erratic and the exact opposite of the kind of, he didn't have the fear-inducing gravitas that I wanted out of that character. And it gives me great pleasure to say that he's back on top form here in Creed 3. He brings this really magnetic combination of kind of this off-kilter, kind of slimy charm with this volatile narcissism that seems to be broiling just beneath the surface of every kind of social interaction he has with characters in the film. But he also conveys this regret and subtly layered sadness that makes him far more empathetic and compelling as a character. He's a very layered villain. I almost don't even really want to fully call him a villain because his motivations are far more complex than he's just I want the title. He's a he of course delivers that boisterous and antagonizing aggression that makes him a very entertaining adversary for Adonis to go head to head with. But as a character, a past a past friend who's was a very sort of formative presence in Adonis's earlier life, who's now come back to assert his presence and reconnect with him in the present time that the film takes place in. He's he brings a lot of detail and sort of variation to the script and story character wise. Perhaps the thing that impressed me most about Creed 3, though, is how much more time is dedicated to unpacking the characters' lives and memories when outside of the ring than even the actual training or the boxing itself. The story quite compellingly dives into themes of reconciling our past feelings of trauma and learning to heal in the present and communicate those feelings in the interest of healing and not keeping them bottled in, learning to adapt when life or a dream doesn't turn out exactly the way we wanted it to. I think taking the time to build out the history between Adonis and Damien, Jonathan Major's character, before they're anywhere near any of the big fights. I mean, those really don't come into, I think, the second half. We spend a lot of time just letting that reconnection just expand and grow. I think it does wonders for the story, and it means that by the time we get to the big conflicts, there's so much more underlying conflict that goes into that eventual showdown. It makes it that much more momentous. Adonis and Bianca's struggle in their relationship also brings added emotional weight. I think the film as a whole makes really good use of its 2 hour runtime. You get the action you want, but you also get that character that I think makes the fights then mean that much more in the grander scheme of the story. And it feels like the character progressions are much more fleshed out by the end. I do wish it went even deeper in on some of those themes of letting go of the past and bottling up emotions. Some of the argument scenes that are trying to be explosive do feel at times a bit measured or even slightly muted. Like, they'll shout at each other, but it's like, oh, it didn't. It kind of lands with a thud. It didn't really, connect in the way they wanted it to. But as a whole, it didn't really stop me from investing in their efforts to grow and help each other heal. And yeah, I really enjoyed Creed 3. It's a big step up from Creed 2. Not the lightning in a bottle revitalization of the franchise that I think the original Creed was, but I had a very good time with this, even if I do think it could have gone even deeper on some of the more emotive character drama. I would give this a solid B+.
Do you think there'll be a Creed 4?
Yeah, I think there's too much. I think there's too much money in this franchise to bottle it out now. Although if this was the last one, I do actually think the ending of Creed 3 is conclusive enough for them to just tie it up and leave it there. But no, I think they'll keep it going some more. Here's hoping they can just continue the streak of quality.
There was a bit of controversy, wasn't there, with this one about whether or not Stallone was going to be in it? Or am I making that up?
No, you're not making it up at all. That's very well documented. I think I'm not super well read up on this story, but my understanding is that in order to get the original Rocky optioned and seen and made, because Sylvester Stallone famously wrote Rocky at a very sort of incredibly low period in his life and was trying his best to break into the industry, and he had no money, and I don't think he had a house, and yeah, it was a very, very dark time. And I think he essentially sold the rights to this very sort of mean-spirited producer and he's been battling to try and get it back to hit, for decades, I think. And I think just again, I'm not super clear on the details, but I think just the fighting and the argument over the state of the franchise and the direction it's going in, and Sylvester Stallone's involvement has reached sort of a peak of venom, and to the point where I think Sylvester Stallone's just like, no, I'm taking my hands off. I'm not going to be involved. And for him, he said in interviews, it's not about the money for me. I want to leave, an artistic legacy, and artistic property to my children, and at the moment I can't do that because of who has the who has the rights.
Yeah, that's actually really disheartening, isn't it? Especially when, a piece of art means so much to someone who created it. I know I'd be devastated being in the same position that he's in. So yeah, that's really sad to hear, but I hope that eventually he gets the rights back and that it becomes his legacy, his cinematic legacy. Moving on then, so we've now got a little bit more of an indie comedy. I was really hoping to watch this when it came out. I wasn't able to, but it is now streaming on Sky, and that's Brian and Charles.
Yeah, so Brian and Charles stars David Earl, who you will know from his work with Ricky Gervais in Derek and Afterlife. Really terrific comedic and dramatic actor. He is the titular Brian. He lives a quite isolated and recluse existence in a very remote home in the Welsh valleys. He's a kind of madcap inventor. He makes all these strange, wacky contraptions that don't always quite work. And there's one where it's a clock that is attached to a bike that Brian is supposed to be able to pedal and fly on. It's like, so if you want to know the time, you just look up in the sky and go, oh yeah, there's Brian on his flying clock. Really, really funny, quirky things like that. And after a particularly dour winter, Brian finds himself in a state of particularly high state of loneliness and depression. And he went out looking for new items to spare on his next sort of spate of creative inspiration. He finds a washing machine and a mannequin head that's been fly tipped, and in what any sane normal person would do when they're feeling kind of alone, Brian decides to build a robot who is named Charles, who then sort of becomes his companion, and they
As you
have a
do.
yeah, as you do, of course,
As you
any
do.
sort of normal
It's
human
normal.
activity.
Normal.
Yeah, and it's sort of about their escapades and their sort of developing relationship. How it's very kind of innocent to start off with, but as adolescents in inverted commas burgeons with Charles, he sort of becomes sort of a bratty teenager, and Brian has to become sort of a parental figure there. And yeah, it's about sort of their bond and their relationship. One of the things that immediately surprised me about Brian and Charles is the aesthetic approach they've taken here. It's got this quite stark, contrast-heavy lighting in some of the interior sequences, alongside being shot in a 239:1 widescreen aspect ratio, which ends up lending the film a far more cinematic look, which I wasn't necessarily expecting, given that this is a pretty offbeat and quirky independent British comedy drama. I would have expected it to just be like kind of handheld in 16:9. On paper, I think that could potentially lead to a stylistic mismatch between, say, the tone of the screenplay and the mood evoked by the cinematography and direction. Actually, for me, what it ended up doing was giving a robustness and a clarity to the storytelling, which I think melded really well with the quirk of the character interaction. There's a terrific opening shot which frames Brian centrally, alone in this rather dingy looking workshop, and slowly pushes in on him from afar as he works on his latest invention. And that immediately tells you all you need to know about his state of loneliness. And I really love it when a film can so clearly and instantly distill and lay out a thematic idea, with its opening shot at the very outset, tell you all you need to know and get you into the central idea. It has a really nice balance between this very homegrown, grassroots, DIY inflected slapstick comedy and how bumbling and cumbersome Charles' movement and physical appearance is, because he has this, huge, boxy washing machine body and these really kind of, flailing limbs and clumsy movement. And then Brian's efforts to control the situation, along with the eccentric wilderness of it reminded me of like the eccentric wilderness of another British indie like Sightseers, for example, and also the incandescent charm of that very underappreciated Frank Langella sci-fi comedy drama Robot and Frank, which actually has a very kind of clear plot link here. Brian and Charles, it's very gently funny and idiosyncratic, but the quirk never supersedes how warm, charming, and empathetic the film's approach to loneliness and compassion and companionship is. It has a lot of heart, but not in an overly sentimental or cloying way. It has this genuine feeling about it, and has great generosity in it. This is helped by how much of a terrific screen presence David Earl is. Obviously, from his past work with Ricky Gervais in Afterlife and Derek, we clearly has spot on comedic timing here, and a great touch for wince-inducing, scrungy, blemished, rugged humour. But what really makes him, for me, such a great performer is that he's able to so effortlessly weave in this underlying pathos and sadness into his characters that then makes it so easy to connect with and invest in them. And you couple that with the solid job the film does with presenting Charles as a credible, sentient being. He never feels like a prop. And you have a wonderfully touching central pair and a lot of actually really great chemistry between them. They have this real ease of communication. I do have a few reservations with the film. It started life as, well, it actually started life as, I think, a radio program, and then developed into a stand-up routine, then into a 13-minute short film, and now into an 83-minute feature. And I think in the transition to being a feature, even at a pretty compact 83 minutes, by the end, I feel like the filmmakers have stretched the subject and story about as thin as it possibly could have been. This also isn't helped by the fact that there are some not particularly graceful attempts by the script to raise the stakes and inject tension that will then sustain the film for the full duration of the runtime. I mean, it's kind of par for the course that when you're expanding a short out into a feature, you need to add in sort of plot lines that are going to, take the film down avenues that will, lengthen the story and give it sort of legs beyond the initial, 10-minute proof of concept. There's a town bully whose family seems to have a long-standing contempt for Brian, and they torment him at any given opportunity. There's also this budding romance with a kindred spirit in the village who takes a shine to Brian. And while both do result in some satisfying late in the day resolutions, on the whole, they're pretty underdeveloped plot lines, and I feel like they could have really done with some more fleshing out. Sometimes the simplicity and the rudimentary nature of the vocal quips and the comedic dialogue, it can feel a little too basic to the point where it kind of affects the jokes and they don't quite land. It's kind of just like, oh, that was a little bit, not immature, just I guess a little bit juvenile. They're just considering, how smart some of the slapstick gags are, and also some of the gags are about, Charles becoming accustomed to his new surroundings and world. Some of the jokes, they feel a little bit below the film's belt, considering the quality of the writing elsewhere. The film also has this kind of strange half mockumentary approach where it has this very kind of bold cinematic visual presentation, like I previously mentioned, but Brian speaks to the camera and the camera operator as though he's kind of being half, loosely interviewed. And this leads to some moments where David Earl, it feels as though he's and Brian, within the context of the film and the film's world, it feels as though he's performing more to the crew that are following him than perhaps the character would have on his own, and if the camera was just kind of like this omniscient viewer of the action. There's this really quietly beautiful moment early on where he watches a flock of sheep walking together. And we see in his facial expression a longing for that feeling of community that the flock have together. And he then gestures towards the camera and makes a quip. There's kind of he sits there and he looks and examines and he's like, oh, wonderful, subtle bit of acting. And then he quips to the camera. And I feel like it slightly undercut that moment. I do think some of the drama would have been more effective if there hadn't been this mockumentary crew implication, if they had just let the character's behavior speak for itself. But you do kind of grow into it, and I don't think it, hampers the overall drama too much. And it's strangely charming and offbeat, and it has real warmth and real empathy. And considering, this could have really been quite irksome and really not worked at all, I think it does work quite well. And I liked it. I would give this a B.
And that is available to stream now on Sky.
It is.
We're also going to talk about, so this is another streaming film. It's been out in cinemas. It's got like a limited release, is that right? In
Yes,
cinemas?
I think it was in cinemas for a week or two from the 24th of February, and it's came on streaming yesterday on Friday, March the 10th.
This is Luther, the Fallen Son, which I'm just going to get it out of the way straight away. Bad title. Not a fan. Not a fan of the Fallen Son. It's not son as in like the prodigal son. It's son as in, the big thing in the sky. And I don't know why, but it gives me like weird fan fiction vibes. You know when things are like titles are too dramatic for their own good. It's like the Fallen Son. And I mean, it's Luther, so it can be dramatic, but it was just for some reason that doesn't quite sit with me. But anyway, so this is a BBC series, Luther, and now Netflix. Idris Elba plays Luther. What did you think? Is this the final kind of installment in the Luther story?
Well, I thought it was
Oh.
until I watched it. So yeah, so very well loved BBC crime drama about a very volatile sort of police officer who's very kind of unethical and at times sort of corrupt methods of solving cases, but he does have this very kind of dogged determination when it comes to pursuing criminals and pursuing justice. And Luther the Fallen Son, again, I agree with you on the melodramatic title, and that does extend to the tone of the film here. But this picks up in the immediate aftermath of the Killer season 5 cliffhanger, where we saw Luther having been arrested after this very very significant character death that he was framed for, and we now he is. This isn't a spoiler to say because it's in the trailer, but he is imprisoned, and he now, with the rise of a new killer in a new case, he has to then find his way out of there and pursue that case and also pursue the clearance of his name. Now, my biggest excitement going into Luther, given that it was one of my favourite shows back in the day, outside of simply having one of my favourite British crime drama series back on screen, I really wanted to see the fallout of that incredible cliffhanger that closed out season 5. And in a crushingly disappointing move, the structure completely bungles this aspect of the story at the very start of the film. It first shows Luther being assigned to the case that will form the later sections of the narrative, which just immediately deflates any sense of tension around Luther's prosecution and imprisonment, because we're effectively told that he will make it back to investigating this outside of the confines of prison. So now I'm just kind of looking at my watch going, okay, how long is it going to be before he breaks out? Which, having seen the trailer after the film, it's actually shown that he does. You don't even get the satisfaction of the thrill of seeing, the immediate aftermath of, his arrest and court case, because the news of Luther's conviction is delivered by this really flaccid expository news report. And the film, very unceremoniously dumps him in prison. It's like, oh, okay, that couldn't have been, less, fluidly handled. It couldn't have been more clumsily handled. Another big misfire for me with The Fallen Son is its style and direction, and the incongruence that then creates with the original series, and how ill-befitting the kind of the Netflix feel is for the material here. I get when you're making a film from a TV series, and of course when you're doing it with a different distributor and production house than the original people, Netflix as opposed to the BBC, you're naturally going to get a slightly different presentation and execution with the final product. But I really do think it's affected this for the worse here. Now, Luther was never a show that really operated strictly within the boundaries of plausibility. When watching a series recap before viewing the film, I was actually taken aback at how ludicrous some of the storylines are on paper when you read about them from the series. But what made them absolutely work on screen there was the rawness of the cast performances and this murky, misty, sinisterly brooding atmosphere the show had. There was this darkness and grit that ran through the show's bloodstream that made it searingly compelling, alongside Idris Elba's really, ripping central performance. And that raw feeling is completely lost here. The Netflix sheen and slickness of this more cinematic formation has sanitized Luther and sucked any soul or shock factor out of the story. And it also contributes to this considerably more bombastic tone and self-serious tone that sits at the register of melodramatic right from the outset. I mean, the title kind of clues you in to exactly what the feel of this is going to be right from the start. And with Luther's laughably easy and convenient prison escape, the preposterous reach of the villain's schemes, these needlessly garish and faux artfully orchestrated murder sequences that are nothing like the boots on the ground tactile raw um, conflicts that we saw in the series, and Andy Serkis's borderline caricatured performance as the villain. The Fallen Sun manages the impressive feat of being eye-rollingly outlandish, but also hugely dull. There's a howl-inducing lack of realism that's then further compounded by some, I don't know what it is with bad visual effects at the moment. We talked about Ant-Man recently. There's some really terrible and unnecessary CGI here, which never featured in the original show. I'm like, why did we need this now? Why do we need explosions and mad car crashes and train crashes? I'm like, oh, can we just?
It's a film, Billy. We're in Hollywood now, darling.
Yeah, But even like Idris Elba's, even his performance feels stripped of that dogged determination and animalistic volatility that infused his character in the original series. The Fallen Sun, just in terms of writing and presentation, it feels so wholly disconnected and far removed from everything that made the series interesting and entertaining to me. In its second half, the Fallen Sun does actually decide to break away from the bravura of the first half, the excess, and tighten its grip back on the atmosphere and more restrained and cold-blooded storytelling that we loved in the original show. However, this seemingly beneficial shift in gears is stunted by a couple of different things. One of it being that the second hour is absurdly elongated and the pace like thuddingly grinds to a halt, even featuring like this needless adventure into frozen tundras that you will have seen in the trailer. Reading as a last-ditch effort to inject, some sort of life into the story through a change of scenery that doesn't really have any, for me, any really solid narrative justification for it. And you get these really horror-tinged sequences of kidnapping and violence against young women that just read to me is kind of ghastly and pernicious. I'm like, this feels really gratuitously inserted here. Why? And the fact that this plodding second hour is propped up by this scattershot and ridiculous first half means that the later drama struggles to have any real weight or credibility due to what has incited it beforehand. It's worth mentioning that this film runs slightly longer than the 2-episode fourth season of the show, and whilst there were criticisms of the fourth season being too condensed, it still managed to get through a lot. Like, it does actually have an arc, the full season, even in, 2 60-minute episodes. And, when you place the Fallen Sun's overlong trudge, at 2 hours and 5 minutes, to the relative tautness of season 4, which runs slightly shorter than the Fallen Sun, it becomes all the more apparent how far we've fallen from grace here. And then to top, all I wanted at the end, even after all of that, was just a nice, conclusive tying up of the Luther storyline, given that we didn't really get a proper conclusive finish with the season 5 cliffhanger. But then what happens is we get an ending that is inconclusive, nonsensical, and hints at a narrative expansion where there should be none. I wanted a satisfying bookend to the series, and I got sequel bait. To say I am unamused is a grave understatement. I'm so disappointed. I love this show.
Truly the Fallen Sun.
Yes, The Fall from Grace, they should have named the film.
Maybe the title is more accurate than I gave it credit for.
They were
Truly the
getting all
Fall from Grace.
they were getting all meta with it.
Okay, so on to our next review, and this one is a bit of a departure because this is not a recent release. This is actually a very old release.
Yeah.
This was replaying at the Watershed. Unfortunately, Billy's had COVID this week, so he didn't get to go and see it on the big screen. But
Very
both
sad.
of us got to watch it on streaming. It's on Amazon, it's on Apple, it's on YouTube for those who want to watch it. So this is Book and the Preacher. It is directed by the incredible, the legend that is Sidney Poitier. And we actually discussed afterwards because I watched this. I'd seen a few Sidney Poitier films, but I was like, you know what? I want to do a Sidney Poitier episode after watching this.
I'm so down.
I really want to just go through his whole filmography and have a look because this was a really good time. I really enjoyed this. So, Book and the Preacher. What were your thoughts, Billy?
Yeah, I had a really terrific time with this too. So centering on a wagon master, kind of at the time in the Wild West when slavery had been abolished and black slaves were freed and no longer, by law, committed to being, servants to, racist white people. And Buck is a black wagon master who takes it upon himself to help transport these free slaves across the West uh, during a time when you still had the advent of discrimination and racist outlaws who were looking to reclaim these slaves and put them back into squalor. And it really does just kind of set itself up as it's been described as the socially conscious Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I think is a really great comparison piece because it really is the most socially conscious and relevant classic Western I can think of, and it has that really fun sort of buddy companionship in it in that Buck meets a con man preacher who is just named Preacher, and they team up and form an unlikely duo and are able to teach each other different things about how to conduct their business. And
Also worth pointing out that the preacher is played by Harry Belafonte, and both Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte were friends or frenemies. They were always competing against each other in real life, and I feel like their chemistry in this film, the way they kind of bounce off each other, that was one of the most enjoyable bits for me.
yeah, no, it's fabulous. They do have a really great rapport. The kind of stern, steely reserve that Buck has versus the kind of the not sinister, the kind of the scheming glint in the eye that Preacher has. They're really great foils to one another and inform each other really well. One thing I didn't realize going into Buck and the Preacher was that Sidney Poitier not only starred in it, but also he also directed it as well. So needless to say, I was very much intrigued to see if his directorial efforts were at all comparable to the legendary caliber of his acting. Now this was especially true, considering Buck takes place in a genre with such recognizable stylistic markers as a western, and one which was revising and potentially deconstructing that cinematic blueprint. And it was such a joy-inducing surprise to see that one of the film's several strengths is its direction. The action sequences are very well orchestrated. The camera placement gives a great handle on the geography of the firefights and very kind of nimbly maneuvers around cover and houses as the foes dart between them and evade gunfire. There's movement and drive, which makes them exciting. He also shows great judgment, knowing when to jab in on those classic spaghetti western and extreme close-ups of faces to inject sort of powder keg tension into those pauses of hiding between the volleys of gunfire. Poitier also has a really good eye for the visual sweep of the Louisiana landscape, but also the intimacy and strong bond between the slaves and Buck as he's trying to transport them across the West. He also peppers in the usual, like, very entertainingly zany crash zooms and whip pans that are now synonymous with the classic westerns of the 60s and 70s.
I was going to say, I did enjoy the direction of this film, but some of those like camera move choices were wild. Like
Yeah, they were.
they kind of come out of nowhere, and then they just like crash zoom into like the most stern face because it's like dramatic. So you get this Scott Pilgrim esque whip zoom into like the crossest looking man you've ever seen, and some of them did kind of, it aged the film a little bit for me. You know,
Yeah,
sometimes
it
it made me
has.
giggle more than it made me, be part of the action. But
Hmm.
considering it's an action film, it's a western. There is a kind of fun uh, action movie style feel to it. It didn't take me too much out of it. It felt quite at home, but at the same time, I was just like, "What was that?"
Yeah. It's like, what was he? But I think that, I do think it ages it a little bit and maybe kind of takes you out of the experience a little bit because you're obviously like consciously going, oh wow, that was a really strange camera move rather than, being totally enveloped in the story. But I do think it like added real character to the film at certain points. And I think in general, the writing, the performances, and Poitier's direction in Buck and the Preacher, it strikes this really terrific balance between, coherently and firmly grasping, the seriousness of the themes and communicating a socially conscious message. He dedicates the film at the very start in the sort of the title cards to the men, women, and children who lie in graves as unmarked as their place in history. A very kind of powerful intro statement that I do think comes across in the interaction between him and the slaves here, and also the racist outlaws that are pursuing them. So he balances communicating this socially conscious message while also keeping a strong hand on this thoroughly pulp laden entertainment. I wouldn't say there's like a tremendous amount of like in-depth script substance, like beyond the broad stroke social commentary that's present in the main plot with the racial tension and discrimination. But because of like the film's stylistic vibrancy and subversive view of the Western within the social and cinematic context of the early 70s, with you know sometimes the lack of inclusivity in historical dramas and westerns, and also the civil rights issues of the time, alongside being very well paced and very energetic and enjoyable, it kind of doesn't need to have that in-depth script substance. It's almost like the formal construction and design of the film within the cinematic landscape of the time. That takes on the substance rather than really deep theme. And it has this narrative tautness between the set pieces and dialogue scenes, which keeps the film like consistently engaging. It does also have some fairly smart script flourishes, even if it doesn't have the greatest thematic nuance. I really loved that scene when Buck's, bargaining with the Native Americans and really respectfully sort of negotiating, the use of their land. And it really deepens that focus on equality and equilibrium between different races in this harsh landscape. And also the implication um, that relationship had been quite long standing, that really came across. And also including that earlier on, it meant that when their presence is shown in like later action sequences, it meant that the film smartly quite like sidestepped the use of like any convenient Deus Ex Machina moments. It's like, oh, the Indians arrived. No, actually, because we'd established that earlier, the presence of the Native Americans really makes sense and seems like a logical progression there.
That was
The
definitely one of my
introduction,
favourite scenes. I really enjoyed
yeah,
that.
me too. I like the introduction of Buck's wife as well in the second half, and how the focus kind of narrowed in the second half to being a bit more quieter than the action. It brought in slightly more emotional weight for me and introduced this interesting conflict between Buck's loyalty to his wife and his commitment to saving the vulnerable and marginalized people. Excuse me, and also the danger his work puts himself in and his responsibility, as being a partner, and the way Buck subtly teaches the preacher social responsibility, whilst Preacher shows Buck a more forceful and sometimes necessary approach to outsmarting outlaws, is also interesting, and it keeps the story freshly developing over the course of the runtime. And of course, Sidney Poitier, the legend that is. I love this man so much. Rest in peace. What a legend. He's in typically excellent form. He just oozes charisma and swagger, and he's so effortlessly cool
He's
and
so cool. He is.
quietly imposing. Yeah, yeah.
There's that bit where he runs into. So you've got these bigoted outlaws who are on the hunt for Buck and the rest of the people that he's trying to get safely across the border. And the preacher has kind of set them up and said that like he was going to pass on Buck, he was going to bring Buck to them. And there's a bit where they're just kind of like discussing him, and who's like, who's this guy? And then he comes out of nowhere with his guns and he's like, Buck. It's like the best shootout that I've ever seen, and the most dramatic death. And I was like, that is iconic. That is such an iconic
Yeah,
moment. Just
he
Buck.
he's kind of, it has, they call me Mr. Tibbs vibes from his role in The
Oh,
Heat of the Night. It's
that
just
man just
so
has the
great.
most iconic lines of any film. It's so good. It's so,
Oh,
so good.
he's great. He honestly, for me, he gives at times he gives Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy a run for his money, and how like tough and like his steely conviction. He's so great in this, and it's just another distinct, you know, cracking performance in his already amazing. He's has such range and such varied performances. One last thing I'd like to say about Buck and the Preacher is that the score is wild. The score is
Oh yeah.
awesome. It has these really like booming primal drums, these bristling, almost like shrill, like tension laden harmonicas that like color the standoffs with like a terrific dose of menace. And I also picture that, Sidney Poitier and the composer had this conversation. And like the composer went, how much jaw harp do you want? And Poitier just said yes.
Yes.
It's it feet it's just like wow, 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 like so much, and it features so prominently early on, and it adds real verve and bite to the chase and action sequences. But I was just like, wow, that's they're really harping on that jaw harp, but thankfully the use of it is dialed back later on into the more sensitive moments, so it doesn't become too overbearing. But yeah, the score is wild, and it really
it is
does add a
truly
lot of
something to behold. Yeah.
adds a lot of personality. But yes, had a terrific time with this, and it's very it has a lot of extra sort of social significance in the cinematic landscape of the time, while also being very entertaining. It was a hoot. I've given this an A minus. Really enjoyed it.
So on to our final film of the week, and this is an animated film that you can watch on Netflix. It's called The Sea Beast. So I've not heard anything about this film, Billy. So tell me, what do I need to know?
Well, this is up for the best animated feature Oscar, which is kind of why I was sort of drawn to it as well. Centers on a young girl who stows away on the ship of a sort of legendary band of sea monster hunters, and through battling some of those monsters and sort of chasing after this illustrious sort of mystical, mythic creature, it becomes stranded on an island. This young girl and the chief, like monster hunter of the crew, and they end up kind of discovering that there's more to maybe these animals than meets the eye, and they start to both learn more about each other and teach each other things about life, and also maybe open each other's eyes as to like the true implications of this hunting that they're doing. And yeah, I was interested to see how it kind of stacked up against the rest of the animated feature nominees. And right off the bat, the Sea Beast visuals. I mean, when you're going into an animated, wondering what the animation is going to look like, and the visuals are very impressive. Some of the markers I would tend to look for in an animated feature as denoting, the level of quality, the extent of the detail there are things like water, hair, sand, grass, foliage, trees, materials and part of the world that have a lot of physical intricacy and texture. If the animation can portray that well, then you get a thumbs up from me. And judging it on these aspects, the Sea Beast animation is of great quality and fidelity. There is a tremendous amount of detail, especially in the character's coarse hair and the way it kind of naturally moves and behaves in the wind and the water. The water is also beautifully rendered. It looks so luscious and silky, which I could also say generally describes the popping colors and saturated vibrancy of the animation. If I were to critique the animation at all, some of the general presentation is like moderately inconsistent. In some of the wides, the lighting can be quite harsh, or the level of detail that I praised before doesn't necessarily come across in the character models. Sometimes a grand vista will appear, very visually sumptuous, but the bodies of a group of characters situated against the backdrops can appear a little sloppy and lackluster by comparison. In close-ups, some of the aspects I mentioned previously, um, the animation does hold up to a lot of scrutiny, and others it doesn't quite. It also in general doesn't have quite the clarity or fluency of movement that, say, a Pixar film has. But then again, what animated film does have that same level that a Pixar film has? Some of the character models also kind of run the gamut of looking angular and a bit bulbous in design. They aren't the most visually appealing I've ever seen in an animated feature. That being said, it's great to see such inclusivity in the cast here, with prominency given to a number of black and female characters alongside the white male and female characters as well. It was really nice to see that natural sort of diversity, baked into the fabric of the story. Early on, there were some quite exhilarating action sequences that involve the destruction and shifting layout of ships that are being overturned and gradually destroyed by sea monsters as the pirates and monster hunters battle with them. And there were compelling uses of movement and shifts in the arrangement of the battleground. The ship will get turned up so it's like kind of perpendicular or like at a right angle, and then that changes the way the crew have got to climb up or move around the boat to sort of gain the upper hand and advantage on the monster, shifting between broken areas of the ship. And the camera makes these well executed and slick long take moves around rope ladders and through cracks in the ship, which really injects some nice kinetic visual spice. And that being said, while there is some, rip roaring, swashbuckling action early on, for the first 45 minutes or so, the Sea Beast, it feels quite paint by the numbers, animated, fantastic adventure. That being said, the narrative and writing really started to impress me when we moved beyond that 45-minute mark. The focus is narrowed in on fewer characters and the carnage is sort of dialed back. And here the Sea Beast very satisfyingly revealed that it's actually quite thematically intelligent. It presents some very intriguing and relevant ideas about inherited prejudices, specifically how literature and rhetoric that has been engineered to fit by a group to fit the narrative of that hateful group, and how that hateful group are trying to marginalize and eliminate another group can then be perpetuated by that literature, that prejudice perspective. That will sound quite heavy for a children's film when I describe it like that, but it's packaged in a way that is really palatable for that demographic. And it also displays great prowess in visual storytelling. There is the central conceit of a book which keys in that theme of the manipulated literature, but more often than not, we see a closed-minded and arrogant or blindly hateful character come to see the truth of his prejudice by seeing the true spirit and compassion of the animals he's hunting, through interactions and comedic set pieces. It shows growth and character development in action, and that it comes from active physical situations rather than, dialogue-heavy exposition or exchanges or big monologues. There are a couple of, slightly on the nose, lines of dialogue that sort of explain those themes, but they're relatively brief. So the growth of the characters is shown in action. The character development shown in action, and that it comes from active physical situations rather than these dialogue-heavy exchanges. I mean, there's the occasional slightly heavy-handed line that sort of quite plainly explains a thematic point, but they're brief. And also, I get that this is for a younger audience, so that is kind of necessary in small doses. There is also several well-executed character arcs that are really solidly balanced across several characters in the cast. And similarly to the point that I mentioned previously, the shifts and leaps in the arcs are incited by the actions of other parties, like the Royal Guard or the animals they're hunting, or the tribes they meet, or the band of monster hunters. It's great to see thought like this given to the themes and character development, and to see a cast whose changes are linked to conscious behavioral responses to events in the narrative. And I really praise that and value that in an animated sort of more children oriented feature. We don't have to sacrifice that in the interest of dumbing things down for a younger audience. So yes, I really like this. I wouldn't say I would say it's still my least favorite of the animated category, but I think that's more indicative of the high quality of the other nominees rather than this. I thought this was very solid. I would give this a B+.
And that is everything for our reviews this week. So thank you, Billy, for filling us in on what we need to be watching. What have we got coming up next week?
So next week we have Pearl, which is the sort of very hotly anticipated prequel to X, the sort of revisionist slasher horror film that sort of took everyone by surprise, I think last year. So starring Mia Goth, that's pretty cool. A24, that's out next Friday. We have Champions, a disability-focused sports comedy starring Woody Harrelson by the Farrelly brothers. I'm looking forward to that. We have a drama, I'm Fine, Thanks for Asking. We have the next installment in the Scream franchise, Scream 6. I kind of thought that we were going to be done with that at Scream 5, but we shall see what the 6th installment has to offer. And we also have a Asian drama, Lunana, a Yak in the Classroom.
So a great lineup coming up next week. Be sure to tune in. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at the Test Screening Podcast.
Yes, I'm sure we will be providing some live updates on the stories, given our coverage of the Academy Awards on Sunday night. Very exciting, and we shall see if any of my predictions were correct.
Thank you for listening, and we will be back next week with more reviews. Bye.
See you next week. Thank you for listening. Bye.